Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. History, and particularly motoring history, is full of stories of false starts, near misses, stories of what might have been, and this is no exception. Here, by Mantassis G over on Race Department, is the Jaguar XJ13 from 1966. The first release of this car was put out to us on the 28th of July of this year, and the latest update in keeping with Assetto Corsa version 1.9 was released on the 15th of November. What I love about this mod and about sim racing in general, as a student of history, I love the fact that technology today allows us to go back in time and to experience something that very few people ever got the chance to experience. In particular, this, the XJ13. It was a stillborn Le Mans class sports car development project by Jaguar in 1966 and 1967. The aim of the company was to go to Le Mans and compete with Ford with their GT40 and of course compete with Ferrari as well, who had been dominant in sports car racing. Ford managed to accomplish that goal, but Jaguar, unfortunately, the circumstances in Britain at the time, the circumstances amid the Jaguar hierarchy, it just wasn't conducive to the development of a Le Mans program. And regrettably, we only ever got one XJ13 produced, and that one car has a very storied history all its own. The car was produced in 1966 initially by Jaguar. It was a development program, again, to try and get Jaguar a presence in sports car racing at Le Mans, to try and go for the all-out victory competing with Ford and Ferrari. Ford managed to do it, however, Jaguar, the company circumstances just weren't right. Jaguar was going through a change of ownership at the time. The economic situation for all British manufacturers in the late 60s and early 70s and even through the 80s was not all that great, so a Le Mans program just wasn't conducive to the overall vision for the survival of the company, and therefore the project was canned, particularly after initial testing revealed that the car was not going to be competitive straight out of the box. The car, as you see it here, is a little bit different from what Jaguar initially produced. In 1971, while doing a photo shoot, the single XJ13 ever produced crashed heavily, received significant body and chassis damage. Eventually the car was rebuilt, but to a slightly different specification than what it had had originally. Therefore, the car that we see here is representative of the one prototype as it currently exists under the care of Jaguar. However, it is not what the XJ13 originally was. What it originally was, however, was an absolute classic. As you'd expect from the mid-60s, we've got a 5-speed transaxle at the back, we've got a small tubular space frame chassis, and we've got a light body on top of it. Peeking through the rear glass there, you can see the 5-liter double overhead cam V12 engine produced in-house by Jaguar. You can see those wonderful intake trumpets there over the carburetors. 12 carburetors, how about that? Or maybe it's fuel injected. I think it's electronic fuel injection, actually, but still, those intake trumpets, you can see wonderful modeling here. But the car just wasn't quite ready for the world, I have to say. Every now and again, history gives us circumstances or personalities that just aren't quite fit for their time. I'm a big fan of classical music in addition to being a car nut. And in particular, I love the work of Wolfgang Mozart. And not most of his works, but so many of his works, over 100 of his works are actually fragments, things that he did not complete. Things that you hear or you read a score and you're just wondering, why did he stop? What happened? And many of his famous works, the C minor Mass, the Requiem, of course, they are unfinished. They're monumental achievements in and of themselves, but one just has to wonder what might have been had they been completed. I get the same feelings dealing with this car here. It's absolutely wonderful for everything that it is, but knowing what the ambition was from Jaguar, wanting to go compete at Le Mans with Ford and compete with Ferrari at Le Mans as well, just you wonder how history might have changed had this project been taken through to fruition and Jaguar had gone to Le Mans. Would they have beaten Ford? Would they have beaten Ferrari? Would they have started their own era of sports car dominance? Nobody really knows. However, what we have here is all that remains of that story, and now it is represented for us so wonderfully by Matassis G over on Race Department for our enjoyment in Assetto Corsa. In the showroom view here, we don't have any opening features on the car, unlike a lot of the native Kunos content. However, you can still get in close enough to see a lot of the detail. We can't even morph into the cockpit here in showroom view. It just hasn't been modeled, but I don't think they were really considering that when they went to design this mod, because it's all about driving, which we're going to do in a few minutes. But I just want to give you an overview of the car, a chance to look around on the outside. You can see the wonderful modeling and texturing work that has been done. You can see the rivet heads there on the left side fender, front fender behind the tire. Wonderful work. The ducting here. Again, you've got to remember this is 60s. We don't really have any advanced aerodynamics. The idea, quite simply at that time, was to make the car as slippery as possible. Downforce? What's downforce? It doesn't have any, but it really doesn't need any either. The tires in this era, they just don't even begin to compare with what tire technology is capable of achieving today. So cornering speeds really were not a factor so much. Again, all mechanical grip limited, no aero. Great work here on the hood, as we call it in America. The front clamshell bodywork, anyway. Great ducting there. I believe this is just for radiators and things like that. Little NACA duct on the front right of the car, and then just louvers to dissipate some heat out the top and back of that panel. Cockpit, you can see in there as best we can. Of course, we're going to be in the cockpit when we drive the car, but great modeling there. Wood rim steering wheel, as you'd expect. Your gear lever there on the right-hand side of the bulkhead, and then all of your gauges to the center and left of the dash. Wonderful stuff. Moving to the rear, you can see these ducts behind the doors. Again, just for some heat dissipation from that engine, probably some air intake as well. And then those big ducts over the rear wheel arches. Probably for a little bit of brake cooling, and probably just to control some of the positive pressure zones that occur in the wheel arches at high speed. But just wonderful stuff all around. Again, this is the car as it exists today. This is not the original 1966 bodywork. There were some relatively small adjustments made during the car's rebuild in 1971 and 1972. They added these fender flares, which certainly make the car look a bit more dramatic. I'm not quite sure if they are functional in any particular regard, but at that point the project had been canned anyway, and I think Jaguar just wanted to preserve the thing for all eternity, which they have managed to do. As far as I can tell, the XJ13 doesn't run very much. In fact, it doesn't break cover very much even. There have been many replicas made of this car over the years, including one that was actually produced under the supervision of Jaguar in the original 1966 specification. However, there have also been some third-party mods, real-world mods, made kit cars, small production numbers, the Proteus P90 I'm talking about. So those are based on the current car as it currently exists from its 1971 rebuild. They have been street legal. There have also been some track-only variants, but they themselves are also extremely rare and extremely expensive. Numbers in terms of performance figures, they practically don't exist because it's such an old car. It was a stillborn project. It never really was allowed to see the light of day. But 5-liter V12, I would say probably around 480 to 500 horsepower. Again, remember, we're talking 1966. The car does not weigh a whole heck of a lot. Again, aluminum construction throughout, so very lightweight, space-age materials of the time. Wonderful stuff. 5-speed transaxle at the back by ZF. So very much run-of-the-mill 1960s running gear. Bias-ply tires with tread, as you can see, so very similar to what you were getting on the Formula One cars of the day. I'm talking about you, Lotus 49. It has very similar handling characteristics, I must say, particularly in high-speed corners. However, what we've got are disc brakes front and rear, which was a bit innovative at the time. However, you can see knockoff wheel hubs, which is, well, of the vintage, you may say. I'm not entirely sure what those nuts are behind the knockoff hubs. I don't know if that was just for some reinforcement of keeping the wheel mounted or if it's a split rim design, but definitely some knockoff hubs there. I'd have to assume that the knockoffs would be used in a race situation because they didn't have the pneumatic wheel guns as it were today, by today's standards, so knockoff hubs, fastest way to change a wheel during a pit stop back then. But absolutely wonderful stuff, and I can't wait to get it out on track. So we're not being too anachronistic. We're going to take it to the wonderful 1967 version of Silverstone that Kunos made available in the latest AC version. So hopefully things look in place in terms of the time period we are discussing. We'll see you there in a moment. Welcome to Silverstone. Of course, before we get on track, we're going to show you some of the setup features that you've got here. It is all very basic because, well, the car itself is very basic. Again, 1966, so we're not talking about downforce or hybrid power units or anything like that. It is just pure engine, pure tires, pure steering wheel. 5-speed gearbox, as I mentioned. You can adjust this any way you like with the exception of first gear. Believe you can adjust that in the final drive. Yes, you can, but nothing else you can adjust individually, at least when it comes to first gear. Second, third, fourth, and fifth, yes, you can play with that. We're actually probably not going to get into fifth gear around this track because, yes, we've got some long straights, but you've got to remember the brakes are of the era, so yeah, you don't want to be pushing that straight line speed too much. We'll shorten the final drive a little bit, perhaps, just to give us a chance to get into fifth. Tires, you've got one compound, the Vintage GT. These are the version 10 tires, so they are the Kunos default Vintage, but you've got one compound, so that's what you've got. Your pressures, you tend to run these tires pretty high, so 30 psi all around is a pretty safe margin. That's more or less modern road car spec on the tire pressure. Fuel, big fuel tank in this car, as you'd expect, goes all the way up to 188 liters. And of course you can get a little sneak peek of that V12 sound. Suspension adjustments, your ride height front and rear, your anti-roll bars front and rear, and that's about it. Alignment, you can change a little bit of the camber and toe settings. Dampers, your bound and rebound there, and generic brake bias, that's all you've got. I'm not going to touch that at all because the car is, as you will find out very shortly, a bit nervous in all conditions, so not going to touch anything with the brakes. We'll get some fuel in the thing, and we'll get it out on track, and you can get a sense of what this thing must have been like to drive all of those years ago. We'll go heavy on the fuel, 80 liters, not quite halfway, but enough for our purposes. In the cockpit here, you can hear that V12 ticking over. Wonderful sounds. Oh yes, that's what we're talking about. 5 liters, 12 cylinders. Absolutely marvelous. Coming out of the pit lane, this odd downward slope on the pit exit, that must have been really safe back in the day. Just gonna be careful here, getting everything warmed up. You can see in the cockpit, not a whole lot going on. You've got plenty of instrumentation, but most of it is actually not visible, at least with my field of view in this eye position. Can't even see the speedometer. There is a speedometer in the car, but it's all the way over off-screen left, so you cannot tell how fast you're going. Not that you're really concerned about that, because it goes very fast in a straight line, considering how old it is. But it's all about making sure you hit your braking points. See the tach there ticking up as the engine chimes all the way to 8,000 RPM. And of course you get a wonderful view out of the windscreen. Great visibility all around. Big rear view mirror on the center of the dash, right where your eyes can pick it up. And of course some great sounds, not only from the engine, but you've also got some clatters and bangs from the chassis, just adding to that overall sense of immersion. Wonderful stuff. Confidence starting to build a little bit now. Got maybe some semblance of heat in the tires. Not that these tires are particularly temperature sensitive. Being 50 years old, they are what they are. I almost don't want to talk. That engine just sounds so nice. It's a very different sound from some V12s that perhaps we're accustomed to hearing, particularly Italian V12s. They tend to be more harmonious, more operatic almost. This from the British Isles, a little bit more throaty, a little bit more mechanical sounding. And of course, it's exhausting through pretty much straight pipes out the back. So there's been no work done to try and tune the sound, as it were, make it sound better. I don't think it needs to sound any better than it already does, however. Coming into Cop's Corner. The car is nervous, as you can probably tell, and I'm being very conservative here in this run, simply because it is such an unforgiving blend of chassis dynamics. You've got, well, basically no braking performance, basically no tire performance, so the car is just constantly skating around on you. Very much like the Maserati 250F that you can also drive in Assetto Corsa, the car is drifting perpetually, and it's just your job to supervise that drift as it caresses the tarmac. In terms of overall chassis dynamics, the car is very well balanced. Understeer that you will get is down to the tires, to be honest, simply because they are what they are and tire technology was what it was back then. In terms of the chassis, the car likes to turn in off throttle. As with a whole bunch of other cars of this era, the chassis stiffness leaves a lot to be desired, so when the engine comes in and starts putting torque down, chassis flex basically cancels out a whole bunch of your turn in. So off throttle is the best way to get the car into a corner at very least, and then you start to apply power gradually as you head toward corner exit. Under braking, as you can see there, when you come off of the throttle, the torque starts to change again, so the chassis flexes in the other direction, and the car starts to get a little bit nervous. Get the brakes on, and that only gets worse. So you've got to be very aware of what you're doing with your pedal inputs, just so you're not overwhelming not only the tires, but overwhelming the chassis itself. Because again, torsional rigidity wasn't a thing. See, the car gives you plenty of opportunities to do some glorious four-wheel drifts, which is not for show. If you look at footage of any vintage cars going around the track, you'll see that that is their bread and butter. It's just how they behave. You have to be willing to allow some oversteer because there's plenty of it, and it's basically the only way to drive these cars fast. You've got to just skate along the tarmac. That engine sounds so nice on the overrun. Just some nice bangs and gurgles for you. Lets you know that you're dealing with something of another time. And you can see there, coming off the throttle, how the car lurches over to the right. Again, that's the torque effect of the motor. Oh, that's out of shape going into the corner there. But you can see once the car gets that out of its system, it quiets down again, and then it allows you to correct for whatever trouble you've gotten yourself into. So provided that you don't overdrive it to begin with, and again, it just takes a little bit of acclimating to get yourself in the idea of going sideways and losing control in a straight line like that, because that can happen. But once you get yourself acclimated to what the car wants to do, you just start to adapt your driving style to the demands of the car. This car drives you, you do not drive this car, as I just demonstrated there rather pathetically. I mentioned when we were in the showroom that after initial testing they found that this car was not going to be competitive with the Ford GT40. I think you can probably tell why. If you've ever driven the GT40 that is native in AC, you'll notice that yes, it has a lot of these nervous oversteering characteristics, but they're a whole lot less prevalent. In other words, Ford, with their chassis dynamics, with their layout, having a V8 engine a little bit lighter than a V12, they were able to control the chassis dynamics a bit better. So yes, it does get nervous, it does have a lot of those torque effects that I talked about, but they're present to much lesser a degree in that car versus this one. And what that means ultimately is it's a bit easier to drive, it's a bit easier to drive on the limit, and therefore you can go faster. I can definitely see perhaps why the Jaguar engineers were discouraged after that first test, because the car wants you to drive it in a stately fashion. It doesn't want to be thrashed, which of course in a race car is not a particularly desirable trait. But just allowing you to indulge a little bit every now and again in a high-speed corner just does give you a sense, maybe, of what might have been had there been a proper development program carried out on this thing, had Jaguar been able to go to Le Mans with it, had they been able to compete. A British V12, little bit of a rarity, but just think about what might have been. You can see approaching the corners, I'm actually turning away from the apex. The car's just flexing its way along the circuit, and I'm allowing Isaac Newton to turn into the corners rather than my arms. Just a lot of power, a lot of torque, but not a whole lot of grip. In a lot of ways, it is very similar to the Lotus 49. The engine is well ahead of the chassis. If you put this engine in a more modern car, say maybe even a Group C car from the 80s, I think it would feel more at home. Be underpowered for the downforce levels, yes, but in terms of drivability, tractability, the engine is right where you'd want it. In this, I know it was all about straight line speed at Le Mans back in the day. There were no chicanes down Mulsanne, and as I mentioned before, aerodynamics really were not a factor, at least in terms of producing downforce. So the engine would have had the straight line capacity to compete, but it just feels a little bit out of place all around. As a motoring enthusiast, however, this is an experience second to none. If you love historic racing, if you love Jaguar, you're going to love this. The modders here have just done an incredible job of giving us a sense of what just maybe it was like to be David Hobbs testing this car back in the day. I'm sure as a racing driver he was a little bit, shall we say, disappointed, because I'm sure he would have been on the factory team at Le Mans had this been given the go-ahead. But at the same time, just for the love of motoring, this must have been an absolutely wonderful experience. And thankfully, due to the work of very talented people in the third-party modding community, we're able to get just a little bit of an idea of what it must have been like in 1966 when Jaguar brought this car out to Silverstone and did some laps. This car is the stuff of legend. If you're a student of motorsport history, you know all about this thing, and now to have the chance to experience just a touch of what maybe it was like, this is something that everybody needs to try. Just trying to find the pit in here. I know I missed the initial turn-in point, but there we go. It's an apron of some sort, and we're going to use it. I'm sure that was totally legal back in the day. Upslope on the pit lane entrance. Again, very, very safe. And there we have it, the Jaguar XJ13. Not the fastest car you're ever going to drive, but certainly just look at it. One of the absolute prettiest that you will ever drive. Just classic shape, classic lines, V12 engine, wonderful experience all around. Matasis G, you have done an absolutely resplendent job with this, and I believe you've done the sim racing and really the motorsport community in general a great service with your work, because they made one of these, and it doesn't really run anymore. And the original was basically lost to the world in a testing accident. So, just wonderful stuff to give us the opportunity to experience what this car must have been like in even the small taste that we can get in a sim. So thank you very much for your work, and thank all of you, my beloved audience, for sticking with me throughout this review, and also for sticking with me throughout the life of my channel. Yesterday I hit 1,000 subscribers, and I have to say thank you very much to all of you. I put up a thank you video already, Rust production I know, but I had to do something, so there it was. This, however, I hope that you will enjoy this. A few of you have been asking for another review video with some commentary, so here it is. A little bit of an offbeat car, a little bit of an offbeat topic, but I do love unanswerable questions just as an intellectual exercise, and this, in terms of motoring history, I believe this is one of the ultimate unanswerable questions. What would the XJ13 have done had it raced? So here, hopefully, we've gotten some insights in terms of what the car actually was, how it drove, and just maybe, had it been taken to fruition, what it might have been able to do. Thank you very much for watching. Of course, stay tuned for 2 hot laps around Silverstone without commentary, just to show you what this thing can do when you thrash it a little bit harder. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much, and stay tuned.